In Quiz 2, we looked at the question of how the church has come to understand what it means to be born again and how people respond through faith and repentance. It also looked at how the gospel message becomes effective for those who hear it. The first question was, according to Augustine, which call is extended only to the elect? The answer is particular call. Now here's why this is important. As mentioned in the debrief from the last quiz, Augustine worked out a lot of his ideas in opposition to Pelagius, who was very optimistic about man's ability to understand his own spiritual condition and reach up to God to be saved. So for Pelagius, a call for salvation would be the same for everyone. But for Augustine, and later also for Calvin, people are not even able to understand the gospel without God's help. Augustine says that a preacher's sermon sounds the same to him regardless of whoever is listening to it. But God takes his message and helps the elect to understand it clearly, while the non-elect cannot understand it. The second question. Since he believed in justification by faith, Luther stopped linking regeneration to baptism. And the answer here is false. And here's why this is important. Luther thought the Catholic Church taught salvation by works. If regeneration comes through the sacraments, these are things that we're doing. We are essentially earning salvation. Luther, on the other hand, said that we are not justified by anything we do, but only by believing the gospel. However, Luther still thought baptism was an essential avenue of grace. He said the external word and water were father and mother, which produced the new life. A lot of people see an inconsistency here in Luther. How can you criticize the Catholics for practicing sacraments which mediate the grace of God when you are essentially doing the same thing? Third, according to the Council of Trent, justification and sanctification were synonymous, and the answer here is true. And here's why this is important. This is, in fact, probably the most significant issue in this chapter. The Council of Trent in the 16th century was the Roman Catholics' response to Protestant theology. Whereas Luther and Calvin made some nuanced distinctions between justification, sanctification, and regeneration, Trent merged these together. As mentioned in the book, here's how Trent saw the issue of salvation. Justification itself is not remission of sins merely, but also the sanctification and renewal of the inward man. Through the voluntary reception of the grace and of the gifts by which an unjust man becomes just. Of this justification, the instrumental cause is the sacrament of baptism, which is the sacrament of faith, without which faith no man was ever justified. In the last quiz debrief, I mentioned these two words, monergism and synergism. Monergism is the view that regeneration is the work of God alone. Synergism is the view that regeneration is the work of God and man together. Trent spelled out a very explicit view of synergism. But while Arminians are synergistic, they would still see that justification and sanctification are very different aspects of salvation. So the linking of justification, how God sees us, to sanctification, how we are becoming holy, is really the most striking difference between Catholics and Protestants. The fourth question, according to Wesley, which kind of grace works in all people? And the answer is prevenient grace. And here is why this is important. Wesley believes that in his natural state, man cannot turn to God on his own. But since he also wants to uphold a more important role for free will than the Calvinists do, he can't propose something like Augustine's particular call, since that would force salvation on people. And so Wesley, like the Catholics, holds to something called Prevenient Grace. This is a grace from God where he will show himself to anyone looking for him. Wesley also believes that this grace is resistible. As you'll remember, the I in the tulip is irresistible grace. The Calvinists believe that when God shows himself to the elect, this revelation of himself cannot be refused. While this might seem like a very minor point, it actually summarizes one of the core differences between Arminians and Calvinists. You'll also remember that the T in the tulip stands for total depravity. And as we think about how God calls people into a relationship with him, it might be better to think of this T as total inability. According to Ephesians 2, people are dead in their sin. Dead people can't make decisions. You can't go up to a corpse and ask it if it wants to be alive again. This is why Calvinists would deny the existence of prevenient grace. Any grace of God, they would argue, will not just be possibly effective, it will have to be actually effective. On the other hand, since Arminians value the idea of free will, they will say that God never forces himself on anyone. Any grace he shows to the non-regenerate people must be an invitation rather than forcing himself on somebody. Fifth, which influential evangelist considered the distinction between regeneration and conversion to be arbitrary rather than biblical? The answer is Charles Finney. Finney was an evangelist like Wesley. He emphasized that evangelism was all about giving people choices. Since he wanted to be practical, he downplayed any distinction between regeneration and conversion. If regeneration comes first, people are passive. God is the one who gives new birth. Finney saw this as an impediment to people trying to respond to the gospel on their own. Of course, in refusing to separate regeneration and conversion, he was actually choosing conversion as logically prior to regeneration, thus showing his sympathy to Arminian doctrine. Okay, so that is quiz 2. See you next time.